Jonathan Reeves, and I'm from ActionAid UK. And I'm just going to take a bit of time to present a report that we're publishing today about climate insurance. So I'd like to just spend a few minutes presenting it to you, and then if any of you are interested to ask questions, then there'll be plenty of time for that. So I'm from ActionAid UK, where I work on resilient livelihoods and climate change. My colleague who supported me with the research from ActionAid Malawi couldn't be here because she couldn't get a visa in time, so it's just going to be me. The report and this press briefing is about climate insurance. Now, insurance has been rising up the international policy agenda over the last few years. And it now features very heavily in international discussions on climate change, including loss and damage, and disaster risk reduction in Sendai, and now here in Cancun, where there'll be various events, side events, sessions on this topic of insurance. And also in the G7, it's a big topic, and potentially the G20 this year as well. Indeed, the G7 summit's happening later this week in Sicily, and the G7 established back in 2015 a target to expand climate insurance to 400 million more people in the poorest and more vulnerable and most vulnerable countries. But the question we ask is insurance the right mechanism to help these people? For us at ActionAid, it's important to look at the question of whether insurance is working for poor and vulnerable people, and is it equitable and effective? So we thought we should do a detailed analysis of a major insurance scheme that hailed by the G7, namely the African Risk Capacity, or ARC, while at the same time looking at alternatives. After a major drought hit Malawi in 2015-2016, I went out there to join up with ActionAid Malawi colleagues and look for evidence about how this scheme was fulfilling its promises. So this ActionAid report is unique, I believe, because it's based on evidence, an independent critical analysis of a major climate insurance scheme informed both by research in Malawi, including interviews with key government officials and ARC officials, and development partners working in Malawi and the rural communities living in poverty there, as well as in-depth analysis of the literature on ARC and other related schemes. This is important because the vast majority of literature you'll find about this big topic of climate insurance is little more than propaganda produced by those running the schemes, which then gets taken up by others without the time or research capacity to dig deeper. But we did dig deeper, and we found evidence. And what did we find, briefly? We found that insurance has got the attention of the G7, the UNFCCC climate process, and the disaster risk reduction processes, strong backing of the G7 and the World Bank. But this report provides evidence that the G7-backed African Risk Capacity drought insurance failed Malawi and its people, particularly its rural women living in poverty, who are hit first and worst by climate change. More than this, the evidence indicates that the insurance model that is being pushed upon poor and climate vulnerable countries by the G7, the World Bank, and other powerful actors is the wrong model for resilience. Meanwhile, proven alternatives remain underfunded. I'm now just going to run through the essential facts of Malawi's experience with the African Risk Capacity before going on to the main messages arising from the research. So in 2015, Malawi paid almost $5 million for drought insurance from the African Risk Capacity, or ARC. ARC is an agency of the African Union set up in 2012 as a mechanism through which African countries could pool their drought risks and buy drought insurance and eventually other services. The rich nations that provide it with returnable capital are also members, hence enabling them to influence its operations. Now, while 32 African countries have signed the treaty to establish ARC, only 6 are currently paying for its insurance. As I referred to earlier, in 2015, the G7 stated it was a leading example of the kind of scheme they wanted to deliver their commitment to extend climate insurance to 400 million more people in poor and vulnerable countries. Now, the insurance policies sold by ARC should, in theory, rapidly pay out a sum of up to $30 million within a few months, ideally less, of a country suffering a significant drought. Such a payout would be triggered if ARC's modelling of the response cost to this drought indicated that a pre-agreed threshold had been exceeded. Now, in April 2016, the President of Malawi declared a state of emergency as a result of a drought induced by El Niño that devastated Malawi's harvest and left 6.7 million people in need of emergency food assistance, according to an assessment made by the government of Malawi and the UN. The estimated response cost was $395 million. Already by May 2016, the drought had resulted in widespread hunger and sickness, especially among children. Some of the women we spoke to had to resort to sex work to be able to buy food for their families. There were also widespread water shortages and blackouts due to the country's dependence on hydropower. Now imagine if at this time quick assistance in the form of cash or food could have been provided. That would have really helped these people and prevented them perhaps from having to sell their scarce assets or resorting to other extreme measures to put food in their children's mouths. That was what the ARC policy, in fact, had promised Malawi. However, the Africa Risk Capacities model estimated that far from the figure of 6.7 million people I mentioned earlier, only 20,594 people had been affected, and the response cost was nowhere near the threshold for a payout. After concerns being raised by civil society and media and the government of Malawi, ARC looked into the possible reasons for the apparent huge mismatch between their model and the reality on the ground. It became clear that one of the main reasons for this was a mistaken assumption about the kind of maize, the kind of corn that was being grown in Malawi. The assumption had been, on the basis of information or the agreement between ARC and the government, that open pollinated or local maize was the predominant type being planted. Whereas in fact most farmers had planted hybrid, quicker maturing maize, in fact designed to be more drought resistant. ARC eventually agreed to make a payment based on this more accurate data regarding the type of maize planted, because once they put this information into their model, the result was, yes, there should be a payout, but a small one of around $8 million. Other defects in the model and the process for its use are likely to have caused this figure to be still considerably lower than it should be. Now, importantly, since this payment was only received by Malawi in January 2017, that's 9 months after the state of emergency was declared, it was too little, too late. The whole point of ARC and other climate and disaster risk insurance in general is that it makes timely payouts when the money is most valuable and can prevent long-term effects on people's health and well-being. The end of this story, if you like, at least in the short term, was that Malawi subsequently decided not to renew its ARC insurance policy, and frankly, who could blame them? Now, from our research, we end up with 3 main messages I'd like to share with you as I wrap up this presentation. 2 conclusions and 1 proposal. First, the G7-backed African Risk Capacity Drought Insurance failed Malawi and its people, particularly its rural women living in poverty. It failed to deliver on its promise of timely assistance, which 6.7 million food-insecure Malawians so sorely needed, due to major defects in the model, data, and process used to determine a payout. Indeed, the insurance model, second point, the insurance model in general being pushed upon poor and climate vulnerable countries by the G7, World Bank, and other powerful actors, is the wrong model for resilience. We conclude, therefore, these actors need to pause and reconsider the evidence through inclusive discussions. They need to stop this headlong rush to convince the poor to effectively gamble their scarce resources on the weather. Now, ARC's African members should be recognized, I believe, for their solidarity and climate leadership in coming up to fill a gap in international support for adaptation, for resilience building. However, they need to go back to the drawing board and design a more equitable and effective African model for climate and disaster risk reduction, ideally with less interference from outside. So instead, finally, we propose a three-tier, equitable and effective alternative model for climate risk finance. First, at the local level, support should be provided, support and training, to help poor people living in poverty to organize themselves into groups such as cooperatives. Now, in these cooperatives, they can establish savings and loan schemes. They can help learn about the most climate resilient, sustainable farming practices, gain better access to markets. They can also, when they reach sufficient capacity and with sufficient training, set up their own insurance schemes, member-owned, not-for-profit insurance schemes in which excess cash stays within these groups. Second, at the national level, support should be provided to help and enable all developing countries put in place adequate, scalable and adaptive social protection systems to provide things such as cash, food and rural works programs to the poor and most vulnerable. Now, by adaptive, I mean these systems should be supporting adaptation to climate change. They should be delivering support to those who are becoming vulnerable as a result of climate change, and they should be providing the support needed to put in place climate resilient agriculture and diversified livelihoods. By scalable, I mean that these safety nets should be able to be quickly scaled up to reach more people, those that in need in light of crises, or to provide more support to those who already needed it. Thirdly, at the international level, rich nations should equitably and predictably fill the gap in domestic resources of the poorest nations to ensure they can fulfill their citizens' rights to social protection and food security, including in the face of crises such as droughts. They should pay into international funds, including climate funds, in a coordinated, predictable and equitable manner that reflects their wealth and their responsibility for climate change, and that ensures that total needs are met. These funds could then be used firstly to fill the gap to enable all developing countries to establish the social protection systems I've mentioned. Secondly, to establish contingency reserves that can be distributed quickly to countries that need them to deal with a potential crisis. So, in a nutshell, that's the three-tier alternative that we propose based on rights, an equitable and effective system using proven mechanisms such as cooperatives, social protection, support for climate resilient, sustainable agriculture, and establishing a more equitable international way of finding the finance to help countries to set up these systems and respond to crises such as droughts, which are increasingly being caused due to climate change. So I'll finish with that, and if anyone has any questions, then I'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
From the Caribbean Media Corporation. I'm representing the media of the Caribbean here, and my question to you is, you spoke about, you gave an example from what happened in Malawi, an African country, and I wish to find out what would be your recommendation for Caribbean countries, for the islands, whose GDP can be seriously affected by 5 hours of rain or just some heavy winds. They can take a tailspin. What would be your recommendations specific to these SIDS?
Thank you for the question. I think the general point remains true that first of all, the priority should be to tackle the structural vulnerability of communities and countries such as SIDS. So, in light of analysis of climate impacts and vulnerability, there needs to be changes in the places that people live, the livelihoods that they pursue, because first and foremost, too many people in climate vulnerable countries are carrying on livelihoods, agricultural practices which are inherently too risky. So there are practices such as agroecology that can provide more resilience to climate extremes, in agriculture, and other diversified livelihoods that can again hedge the risks. Would be the first point. Second point is, as I said, there needs to be adequate social protection, first of all, to help reduce vulnerability of the poor, because it's always the poorest and that are most vulnerable to these climate extremes. That needs to be, again, the priority. But again, I think the point is that these safety nets then need to be scalable. Now, in the Caribbean, there's a similar mechanism to ARC in the form of CRIF. It's different in that it's not for droughts, it's for hurricanes, and there are differences in the kind of index used to trigger payouts. But while there have been some quick payouts there are major questions there about the effectiveness of the scheme, the transparency of the scheme, where the money actually goes, is it reaching the poor and vulnerable? So another recommendation there is that these schemes need to be made more transparent, there needs to be more monitoring and evaluation, and more participation of the people they're intended to serve in their design and operation. Now, in this case, again, some of the countries can't really afford to pay the premiums for the CRIF. You have country, I think it's only Haiti that's getting a loan, or not getting a loan, but getting a grant to pay the premiums. Whereas, in fact, other still fairly poor Caribbean nations are having to take out loans, increasing their already high levels of debt in order to pay the premiums for this insurance. This is a clear case of climate injustice, and this is where we need to look for alternative models where it's the rich nations that cause this climate risk that are paying the costs of the mechanisms to improve resilience to climate change. So that would be my response regarding the Caribbean. Thanks. Okay, any more questions? I have copies of the report. If anyone's interested, I'll be happy to distribute that. Thank you.